What's up, class? This lecture is going to be on Chapter 28, Section 1 and Section 2. And this is going to be a general overview on a time period called the Age of Anxiety, which would be the years between World War I and World War II. So we're stretching roughly between 1919, 1918 to 1935. Now, in the wake of World War I, with its mass destruction and wholesale slaughter, many people began to lose faith in the Enlightenment ideal of ongoing human progress. They felt that a sense of disconnection and doubt about the future, and new events and ideas in science and just the general world around them raised even stronger doubts about the predictable nature of the world and that there would always be continued progress. So people became kind of disenchanted with progression, science, and reason, and began to look at the world in different ways. Further complicating matters was immediately at the end of the war, and actually like during the last year of the war, a massive global pandemic is going to strike. And this is the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is going to end up killing over 18 million people that we know of for sure, which is actually more people that died from this disease than died from fighting in the war itself. And it's called the Spanish flu because like the first cases were reported in Spain, but Spain didn't really fight in World War I, and their media wasn't as censored as other countries. And so there's actually reported cases of the Spanish flu in other parts of Europe before cases in Spain, as well as in the United States. So it probably isn't a fair name, but that's why we call it the Spanish flu. And this disease just rolled throughout the world, and it struck all kinds of chaos and led to many deaths. And after 4 years of brutal fighting, to have this happen and to have this kind of scale of death that's equal to the war, it further upset and confused people during this time period. Events like the influenza pandemic increased many people's feelings that the world was a frightening and unpredictable place. Some looked to the ideas of new thinkers like Sigmund Freud, who's the guy on the top there, or Albert Einstein. Freud claimed that the unconscious, that not your rational mind, but the things that are happening when you're not purposely thinking about it, often control the person's actions. And this would seemingly explain many of the confusing and irrational events in life, that our impulses make us do things not necessarily the way we think in our conscious mind. Some people use Freud's ideas to understand the dreadful destruction of World War I and the continued uneasiness that confronted people around the world, kind of fed into these new theories on human thought and psychology. Other people look towards science, and they're going to use scientific theories to support their disillusion with the attitudes that they felt from the war. People who had believed that social standards of morality or artistic taste were not absolute pointed to Albert Einstein's argument that even such definite concepts as motion, space, and time were all relative. And so this goes to his theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. And it's kind of the idea that like if you can tinker with like the speed of light, how fast things move, time changes. And Einstein kind of famously gave the example that like if you put somebody in a rocket ship that travels at the speed of light and you have them travel for a year in our time, by the time they land, because they're traveling at the speed of light, time works different when you move that fast. And they would not have aged a year, even though they've been traveling a year. They would have only aged like a month, 2 months. And this sort of theory, which we continue to explore today, has really destabilized and made people more uncomfortable with time in physics. Furthermore, the major writings of World War I and of the years after during the Age of Anxiety showed increasing dissatisfaction with traditional ideas and traditional writing narratives. Some writers tried to offer a new vision, and German historian and philosopher Oswald Spengler, he's going to express the mood of the era with his book, The Decline of the West, where he argues that civilizations pass from youth to maturity to old age, and then to death. And he's basically saying that at this point after World War I, European Western civilizations are beginning to disintegrate and are entering that final death stage. People read this, they agreed with it, and it really caused a lot of fear and frustration. Probably most famously, there's going to be a group of American authors who will express their disillusionment, and they're going to include several writers that started in the United States, but then ended up moving to Europe so they can feel like they could better express their ideas. And they are known as the Lost Generation. This name comes from the American writer Gertrude Stein, and some of these famous Lost Generation writers are Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and they wrote stories kind of about just like, the frustration of life and failure, and like they questioned some of the goals and values. So like F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, where he basically says that a generation of Americans had lost their moral grounding or more concerned about partying and excess than like things that actually matter, meaningful relations, love, and personally striving towards goals. Ernie Hemingway wrote a lot about death and like what it means and why people fight. And so his most famous works, probably The Sun Also Rises, but he was a pretty prolific author. Other writers will experiment with different types of writing. They'll use this thing called surrealism. And surrealism brings conscious and unconscious ideas together to portray life like in a dreamlike way. And so like they kind of try to show feelings and emotions rather than like logical discussions and discourse. So Franz Kafka's writings kind of have a meandering writing style and can be awfully confusing, but they're meant really to inspire like a sense of feeling in a person as opposed to like critical thinking and like descriptive discussion. And another person would be like James Joyce, who will write his book as a stream of conscience. So like just kind of random thoughts popping up. So there's a story, but it kind of hops around just like your brain does, how you can't really stick on one thought at one time for too long. And so James Joyce kind of keys this method of writing, which inspires other writers, this experimentation. We also see new styles of painting. So that picture down in the middle there is a Picasso painting, and it uses cubism. So inspired by West African art styles, Picasso will use cubism to, again, use surrealism and to try and change the way people painted. Dadaism is going to be a new form of art. It's kind of art that uses random objects and images that will reflect what people consider the insanity of war. And so you might look at it and go, I don't know what this is. It seems like kind of chaos and a bunch of garbage, but it's really trying to tell a story. Salvador Dali will also be a pretty famous painter. He'll paint a lot of images that are surreal. His most famous one is The Persistence of Memory, which is where you have a bunch of like melting clocks in this kind of wasted urban landscape. And then in architecture, we'll also have a lot of experimentation. We'll see the increased use of skyscrapers, which is kind of being pushed along by a guy named Louis Sullivan, an American architect. And Frank Lloyd Wright will develop a new style of building where you build homes that fit their environment. And so they're unorthodox, kind of like floating homes that are built around their landscape, built into hills, and will become very popular during this time period. And this is also the age of jazz, especially in the United States, blues and that kind of style of music. Now, while people are feeling anxious at this moment, there will be an even bigger issue that arrives towards the end of this time period, and this is the Great Depression. The Great Depression is going to be a global economic crisis that will begin in the United States, but will then impact all countries of the world because the global economy is becoming more intertwined. And signs of trouble, like signs of this depression was going to happen, because it'll begin in 1929 and go throughout the 1930s, had actually begun earlier in the 1920s. And so one sign of trouble is that farmers had been using modern technology to overproduce crops, and they were growing more and more crops. And since there was more and more crops available, the price of the crops went down and they became less valuable. And so this was a big issue during World War I, because more food was needed to feed the soldiers and people at home. And not every country could grow crops because a lot of their farmers were fighting in the war. But when the war ended, every country was doing this overexpansion of agriculture. And if you were a farmer, you essentially struggled to make a living, and you couldn't pay your debts and you might lose your farm. And so that big part of the economy became at risk, and this is one of many causes for the Great Depression. Another one is economic nationalism, or the policy of using protectionist tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports, and you put a tariff on your country so that, like, if a country tries to sell you their cheap goods and you have factories in your country that make those same goods, but they can't be as cheap because it would cost jobs and stuff. These tariffs make those foreign products more competitive with American products. They raise the price of the foreign one to protect American or your country's businesses. And at this time, every country was kind of practicing this economic nationalism of using tariffs to bolster their own industries and hurt other countries. And it really prevented countries from trading with each other, which negatively impacted trade across the globe and further weakened the economy. While you want to protect your industries, you also want to encourage your industries to trade with others to make more money. And economic nationalism and tariffs made that hard to do. And then speculation is going to feed into the stock market crash. The event that seems like as like the beginning of the Great Depression is when the American stock market crashes on Wall Street. A lot of people have been buying stock in companies, and the idea was throughout the 1920s, American companies had inflated stock values. So you could purchase, a percentage of a company, like a really tiny percentage, one day, and then like a month later, because of this prosperous economy during the early 1920s, that stock value would go up and it'd be more valuable, and you could then sell it and make money. And so people were speculating and just buying random stock, and stock prices weren't accurate, and they were being told that some stocks were doing quite well and companies were doing quite well, when in reality they were struggling and people were being lied to. And eventually what's going to happen is speculation will become so rampant that in 1929, we get to Black Tuesday, when people begin to realize that these stocks and these companies' values are inaccurate. People are going to begin trying to sell their stocks, and there'll be this big rush to sell stock that's going to cause the stock market to crash. And this is Black Tuesday. When the stock markets crashed, a lot of banks had stock in companies, and they used the money that people gave them to purchase stock and to invest and make money from it. But when all those stocks failed, the banks lost the money they had, and that money would be the savings of people who use those banks. And so people went to go collect their funds from the banks, and the banks would tell them that their life savings, the money they had, was all gone. And this further pushes the Depression to even worse standards. People lost a ton of money in the stock market. They then lost money because banks had misused their funds, their savings, to invest in the stock market, and the money was gone. So people lost their life savings as well. And this just sort of feeds into itself, and it leads to the Great Depression. Some characteristics of the Great Depression would be low wages. People that did keep their jobs, companies were struggling. They had to lay off a lot of workers, and they couldn't afford to pay their workers competitive prices. So they were not getting paid much. So the wages were low. High unemployment. If you couldn't get a job with low wages, you probably were laid off. And you have a lot of Americans, roughly about a quarter of working Americans, but this again will be a global depression, that are unemployed and can't find work and will be unable to support their families. And since there is people making less money that are working and a lot less people working, so they have no money that they're making, they can't afford to buy stuff from businesses, which decreases business activity and leads to further wage decreases because companies aren't making money, and also further layoff, people losing their jobs. And this began in the United States, but the United States had been such a big trade partner with so many countries that when we lost our economy and it began to struggle, other countries lost American business and their economies began to struggle as well. And it leads to this massive global depression across the globe. And it's this depression that is going to lead to all kinds of unrest and tension. And it's going to open the door for a lot of radical groups to kind of seize power, and a lot of reactionary groups to seize power as well. And so in like the late 1920s and early 1930s, countries will do all kinds of things because of the Great Depression and other issues during the era. So for Great Britain, for example, they're going to go through a lot of economic troubles before the Great Depression, and the Great Depression makes their economic troubles even worse, which causes all kinds of tension. When your economy's poor, you tend to have lots of issues in your country. Um, their poor economy is going to lead to labor unrest, and they'll see the rise of more socialist ideas and the Labor Party, and will experiment with different political parties in their parliament. And during this time of economic crisis, they'll also deal with political crisis. Ireland is going to want its independence, and because of an event called Easter Rising, it's a uprising led by Sinn Féin, a political party in Ireland that wanted Ireland to become independent. At the time, it was part of Great Britain, but they wanted to be their own separate country. There'll be this big push for Irish nationalism, and eventually, because of terrorist action, political action, and tension between Britain and Ireland, Ireland will get its independence, but it will be divided. And we'll have a Northern Ireland that remains part of Great Britain and a separate Ireland. So the island of Ireland is divided in half. And this is going to lead to all kinds of fighting and tension for the next several decades. And even today, there's still tension. People in Ireland want Northern Ireland to be part of Ireland, not a separate country with Great Britain. And there's people in Northern Ireland that want to remain with Great Britain. So kind of unresolved issues there. In France, they're going to continue to sort of lick their wounds from World War One. They had an extremely high population that was killed, especially young men, and their economy will be inflated because of all the wartime productivity and overprinting of money. And so, to kind of adjust for all these lost soldiers and to try and stabilize the economy, the nation tries to use this big defensive project called the Maginot Line. Basically, the French felt that sometime in the future, Germany, even though they'd been heavily weakened after World War One, would once again invade France because they'd already done it 2 other times that century. It was only a matter of time till they would do it again. And during World War One, trench warfare became the new style of fighting. And so the French thought, why not build the biggest, baddest, most intense trench ever? And they began constructing the Maginot Line. The line would be along the border of France and Germany. So it'd be hard for Germany to break through this super big trench. And it's called Maginot because it's named after the French general whose idea it was. This Maginot Line would be layers of concrete. There'd be elevators that would drop soldiers down below, and they would have underground tunnels and a railway system, showers, bunkers, food dining areas, and like machine gun turrets and layers of barbed wire and trenches. It was basically just like the ultimate trench, so that it'd be almost impossible for Germany to break through that. To make this, though, instead of stimulating the economy, it actually further weakened the economy. It cost a lot of money, and it put France in a pretty dangerous situation where their economy became unstable during the Great Depression because of all the money they spent on this Maginot Line. And just like in Great Britain, because the French economy began to struggle, new social groups and political groups began to rise. And so socialism will be on the rise in France for a period of time. And the socialist political party was called the Popular Front. They'll seize power and try and promote socialist ideas, universal health care, consistent minimum wage, wins for labor unions. But then they'll lose power in the 1930s. But they'll also, you can see kind of how they've been destabilized during this time period. And then 2 more places to consider. Austria, which was once Austria-Hungary, but is now just Austria, is a much poorer nation. When they got divided after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, they lost a lot of valuable land and a lot of money. And there will be socialist tensions and conservative tensions in their country. So basically the far right reactionaries, people that want strong central government and a strong military, were going against people that wanted communist and socialist ideas and greater equality. And so they'll be kind of fighting themselves. So they'll be kind of going through a civil war. And a lot of Austrians are going to want to be part of Germany. They're going to want to be united with the German country. But the Treaty of Versailles strictly forbade this. And so people will be frustrated politically, and there'll be lots of political tension in Austria. And then our last country we're going to look at is Hungary, which would be the other part of Austria-Hungary that was divided. They will actually embrace communism, and this government's going to fail. And as a result of this failing communist government, there'll be a military dictatorship. And they switched to communism because of the economic struggles that are going on during the Great Depression. They are becoming desperate for new ideas to stabilize their economy. So they embraced communism until they end up switching to a military dictatorship. Their new borders impact their economy even worse because they lost a lot of farmland and a lot of valuable resources that had stimulated their economy prior. And they are going to become dependent on loans from foreign countries, which will dry up during the Great Depression and cause them further issues. So in general, a lot of countries are really struggling during this time period of, this age of anxiety. So while there were new ideas and a thriving economy in the 1920s because of the Great Depression, it causes all kinds of unease and trouble that nations will struggle to adjust to.